But I go, can I just try another one? That moment comes and I just go, this is Sparta!
He screamed two words that echoed through pop culture for almost 2 decades. This is Sparta turned Gerard Butler from a working actor into a symbol of raw, unfiltered masculinity almost overnight. But long after the swords stopped clashing and the blue screens went dark, Butler started talking, really talking, about what it actually took to become King Leonidas. What he's described isn't a glamorous behind-the-scenes reel. It's a story about a production that pushed bodies past their limits, about a cast that bled for a movie most executives didn't believe in, and about a leading man who says the role nearly broke him before it ever made him famous. This is the story fans think they know, told through the parts nobody put in the trailer. For most of us, 300 exists as a highlight reel of memory. The roar, the kick that sends a messenger into a well, the six-pack abs, the wall of shields. It's a film that's been reduced, over years of meme culture and casual rewatches, into a handful of iconic images. But strip away the familiarity and go back to what the people who actually made it have said in the years since. And a very different picture emerges. One of a cast operating at the outer edge of what their bodies could physically sustain on a production that had no roadmap for how to make a movie like this safely, because nothing quite like it had really been attempted at this scale before. What follows isn't a takedown of the film or an attempt to diminish it. If anything, understanding what it actually cost to make makes the achievement more impressive, not less. This is that story. When 300 arrived in theaters in the spring of 2007, it wasn't positioned as a guaranteed hit. It had no A-list marquee names carrying it, no franchise history, and a premise that sounded like a hard sell on paper. A stylized retelling of an ancient Greek battle, shot almost entirely against blue screens, based on a graphic novel rather than a history book. Studios don't usually throw their full weight behind that combination, and yet audiences showed up in numbers nobody predicted. The film opened to a stunning debut weekend and kept climbing from there, eventually pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide against a production budget that was modest by blockbuster standards. It became one of the most profitable studio releases of that year, and more importantly, it became a cultural moment. People weren't just watching 300, they were quoting it, memeing it, and trying to look like it. That last part matters more than most people realize. The sculpted, larger-than-life physiques of the Spartan army didn't just sell a movie. They sold an entire aspirational body type. Gyms built entire marketing campaigns around replicating the Spartan look. Personal trainers built client programs promising to turn regular guys into 300-style warriors. An action movie somehow became a fitness culture reference point, and the man at the center of that transformation was Gerard Butler. Part of what made the film's success so unlikely was the source material itself. Frank Miller's graphic novel was beloved among comic readers, but comic adaptations in the mid-2000s were still a gamble. This was years before superhero films dominated every summer release calendar, and a stylized retelling of an ancient Greek battle wasn't an obvious template for a blockbuster. There was no built-in franchise machinery, no theme park tie-in, no existing cinematic universe to slot it into. It had to succeed or fail entirely on the strength of its own identity. That identity turned out to be exactly what audiences didn't know they wanted. The film's slow-motion combat, its near-monochrome color palette, and its unapologetically operatic dialogue gave it a texture unlike anything else playing in theaters that year. Critics were split. Some dismissed it as style without substance. Others recognized it as a genuinely new visual language for action filmmaking, but audiences didn't wait for consensus. Word of mouth spread fast, driven largely by the sheer physical spectacle of the cast and the quotability of its dialogue. But the version of the story that made it into magazine profiles and DVD extras was the polished one. The real story, the one Butler has only pieced together publicly in interviews years later, is far messier, far more painful, and in some ways far more impressive than anything that made it to screen. Ask Gerard Butler about the day-to-day reality of shooting 300, and one theme keeps coming back. Injury was constant, not occasional. According to Butler's own recollections, it wasn't unusual for someone on set to need medical attention on any given day. He's described turning around mid-fight sequence to see a castmate down after a mistimed blow, or hearing that someone had broken a bone during a fall that looked routine in rehearsal. That kind of environment wasn't an accident of bad luck. It was baked into how the movie was made. Director Zack Snyder wanted the fight choreography to feel visceral and immediate, and rather than leaning heavily on stunt doubles for wide shots, many of the principal actors performed their own combat sequences. That decision produced footage that looked more authentic and more brutal on screen, but it also meant real bodies absorbing real impacts, over and over, take after take. The actors were working with weighted armor, real, if intentionally dulled, weapons, and tight staging in a confined studio space, all while trying to hit precise choreography marks under bright, hot lighting rigs. Add repetition into the mix, dozens of takes for a single sequence, and the odds of injury stopped being a possibility and became a mathematical certainty. Bruising, muscle strains, and lacerations were treated almost as background noise on set, the ordinary cost of doing business on a film like this. For Butler specifically, the physical toll went beyond bumps and scrapes. He's spoken about the sheer exhaustion of doing physically demanding acting work against blue screens, where there was no real environment to react to, just imagined enemies, imagined terrain, and imagined weather, all of which still required full body commitment to sell convincingly. Acting against nothing while your body is running on fumes is its own kind of exhausting that audiences never see reflected in a finished shot. There's also a psychological dimension to this that rarely gets discussed. On most film sets, physical stunts are heavily insured, tightly choreographed, and buffered by layers of safety review specifically so that lead actors are protected from real risk. On 300, the sheer volume of hand-to-hand combat sequences, combined with the decision to have actors perform much of their own fighting, meant that safety planning had to happen at a scale most productions never attempt. Every take carried some baseline risk, and multiplied across months of principal photography. That risk compounded into a set where injury wasn't an exception to the routine, it effectively was the routine. Crew members have echoed similar sentiments in later interviews, describing a production where medics were a near constant presence rather than an occasional necessity. That's a detail that rarely makes it into a making of featurette, because it doesn't fit the triumphant narrative studios prefer to sell alongside a finished film. But it's central to understanding what the cast actually went through to deliver those 2 hours of screen time. If the shoot itself was punishing, the months leading up to it were arguably worse. Long before cameras rolled, Butler and his co-stars entered a training regimen that has since become almost mythic in fitness circles. Working with strength coach Mark Twight, the cast underwent months of preparation designed not just to build muscle, but to reshape how their bodies moved, endured, and recovered. The training blended elements that don't usually appear together in a single program. High-intensity conditioning work, traditional strength training, martial arts drills, and functional movement patterns borrowed from military and athletic conditioning circles. Actors were flipping tires, working with kettlebells, running through obstacle-style circuits, and grinding through repeated bodyweight exercises until failure. This wasn't a 6-week movie star shred designed purely for aesthetics. It was engineered to produce actors who could actually perform demanding physical choreography without collapsing. Butler has said the preparation stretched across several months, with individual training sessions running for hours at a stretch. The goal wasn't just to look like a Spartan king. It was to move like one, with the explosiveness, control, and stamina the role demanded during long shooting days. The cost of that transformation showed up in his body afterward. Butler has openly discussed dealing with tendon problems, hip issues, and a shoulder injury that at one point made it difficult to lift his arms. He's described the training itself as something that wore down his body even as it built up the physique the world eventually saw on screen. It's a strange contradiction. The very process that made him look invincible left him quietly falling apart behind the scenes. And the training didn't stop once filming began. Actors kept working out between setups to maintain their conditioning and physical appearance throughout the shoot, meaning there was essentially no period of rest across the entire production. Preparation bled directly into filming, and filming bled directly into more preparation. What made the Jim Jones approach distinctive wasn't just its intensity. Plenty of Hollywood transformation programs are intense, but its philosophy. Dwight reportedly resisted the idea of training actors to simply look impressive under studio lighting. Instead, the emphasis was on functional capacity. Could an actor actually generate the explosive power needed to swing a weighted prop sword through dozens of takes without his form breaking down by take 30? Could he sustain that output across a 12-hour shooting day? That distinction between looking strong and being strong enough to survive the shoot shaped nearly every decision in the program. And it's part of why the training became so influential once details leaked into the fitness world. Once gyms and trainers got hold of the workout structure, it took on a life entirely separate from the film itself. Adaptations of the routine appeared in fitness magazines, and personal trainers built entire client programs marketed around achieving the Spartan look in a matter of weeks. Usually a far more compressed and far less medically supervised version of what the actual cast endured over the better part of a year. That gap between the real program and its commercialized copies became its own minor controversy in fitness circles, with some trainers cautioning that the compressed versions carried real injury risk for average gym goers without a production's medical support system behind them. What separates Butler's account of 300 from a standard tough shoot story is the emotional and psychological investment he brought to the role, which he's described in strikingly personal terms. He didn't approach Leonidas as a character to be performed and then set aside at the end of the day. He's talked about using meditation as a way to get into the headspace of a man who knowingly led his soldiers toward near certain death, trying to genuinely access that mindset rather than simply imitate it externally. That level of commitment extended into his insistence on doing as much of his own physical work as possible, even when it put him at risk. For Butler, performing the stunts himself wasn't about proving something to an audience. It was about respecting the weight of what the character represented. He's described the experience of throwing himself fully into the film's major battle sequences as one of the most intense adrenaline experiences of his career, a kind of total physical and emotional immersion that's hard to replicate through half measures. That pattern, throwing himself into physically dangerous situations in pursuit of authenticity, didn't stop with 300. In other productions across his career, Butler has found himself in genuinely hazardous situations, from extreme cold weather conditions to high-risk stunt work involving vehicles and explosives. 300 wasn't an isolated case of a committed actor taking one big risk. It was an early, defining example of a pattern that would follow him through much of his filmography. Adding to the difficulty of the shoot, much of the film's violence and bloodshed was created digitally after filming rather than through practical effects on set. That meant actors often had to imagine the visceral consequences of a wound or a killing blow in real time, reacting with full conviction to something that wasn't actually there yet. There were no blood packs, no visible gore cues, no physical reference points. Just imagination, discipline, and trust in a director's vision that wouldn't fully materialize until months later in post-production. This kind of performance discipline is easy to underestimate from the outside. Actors are generally trained to react to something: a scene partner's expression, a practical effect, a physical obstacle in their path. Stripping all of that away and asking someone to generate a convincing, visceral reaction purely from internal imagination, take after take for months, is a fundamentally different acting challenge than most blockbuster productions require. It's closer to the demands of stage actor working with minimal set dressing than a typical big-budget action shoot, and it's a skill Butler has said he had to develop almost in real time as filming progressed. That same appetite for full immersion shaped how Butler approached Leonidas's voice and physicality as well. Rather than treating the King's booming, theatrical delivery as simple, stylistic exaggeration, Butler has described trying to find an internal justification for why a leader would speak and carry himself that way, treating the heightened performance style not as a gimmick, but as an expression of a very specific kind of authority, one built to rally soldiers who were about to march to their deaths. That interpretive groundwork rarely shows up explicitly on screen, but it's part of why the performance reads as commanding rather than cartoonish, even amid a film that leans heavily into stylization everywhere else. The visual identity of 300 was as unconventional as its production method. Rather than shooting on location or building elaborate physical sets, the majority of the film was captured inside a studio, with actors performing against blue screen for the vast majority of their shots. The landscapes of ancient Greece, cliffsides, throne rooms, battlefields, were constructed almost entirely in post-production. That approach gave the filmmakers extraordinary control over color, lighting, and atmosphere, allowing for the film's now iconic desaturated, high-contrast look. But it came with real costs for the people working under those conditions. The specialized lighting setups needed to achieve that stylized visual effect generated significant heat, turning the soundstage into an uncomfortably hot environment for actors wearing heavy armor and performing demanding physical work for hours at a time. Butler has acknowledged the toll this took directly, describing an incident where he passed out on set from a combination of dehydration and overexertion. Long hours under hot lights, layering costume, executing complex fight choreography. It was a recipe for exactly that kind of physical breakdown, and it wasn't a one-time fluke so much as a predictable outcome of how the film was made. Even performance choices on set reflected the production's improvisational, mood-driven approach. Some of the film's more surreal or dreamlike dialogue moments were shaped in the moment rather than locked down entirely on the page, giving certain scenes an eerie, unscripted quality that added to the film's mythic, larger-than-life tone. Snyder's approach to 300 was also notable for how heavily it relied on pre-visualization. Long before principal photography began, entire sequences were mapped out almost shot for shot using digital previs tools, essentially giving the director and cinematographer a rough animated blueprint of the finished film before a single frame was captured. That level of pre-planning is part of why the movie's action reads as so precisely composed. Every camera angle, every beat of slow motion had often been worked out digitally months in advance. For the actors, that meant performing to a level of choreographic precision that left very little room for spontaneous physical improvisation during fight sequences. The emotional performance had to be layered on top of an almost mathematically predetermined physical structure. That rigid pre-visualization process is also part of why so many takes were required for individual shots. A single beat of a larger sequence might need to be reshot repeatedly, not because the acting was wrong, but because the timing needed to align precisely with a pre-planned camera move or a visual effect that would be layered in later. For a cast already exhausted from months of physical training, that meant grinding through repetition not for creative reasons, but for technical ones. Another layer of physical demand that rarely gets discussed when people talk about the film's visual innovation. Ask Butler what actually got the cast through months of exhausting training and a grueling shoot, and his answer consistently comes back to the relationships that formed among the ensemble. The actors playing Leonidas' warriors weren't just performing camaraderie for the camera. They built it for real, through shared physical suffering that started well before filming and continued throughout production. Training together for hours each day, pushing through identical workouts, recovering side by side. That repeated shared hardship created a bond that Butler has described as central to making the on-screen brotherhood believable. It wasn't choreography or dialogue that sold the idea of Spartan loyalty in his telling. It was the fact that the actors had genuinely been through something difficult together and had come out the other side with real trust in one another. That bond extended to the rest of the ensemble beyond the core group of warriors, including cast members playing characters outside the battlefield scenes. Shared complaints about the heat, the isolation of acting against blue screens for hours on end, and the general physical grind of the shoot became a kind of connective tissue between people who might otherwise have simply been co-workers on a demanding job. Several cast members have since credited that group dynamic with helping them push through the more difficult stretches of production and stay emotionally committed to a film that, at the time, had no guarantee of resonating with audiences at all.